somewhere between who you were and who you planned to be. You got stuck. You're not lazy. You're not broken. You just never got the blueprint. Tonight, we fix that. Tonight, you don't need to try so hard. You don't need to fix everything. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to be someone different than who you are in this exact moment. Just lie there. Settle in. Feel the weight of your body pressing into the mattress, the way it holds you, the way the bed seems to rise up to meet you when you finally stop moving. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands open, palms up, fingers loose. Take a breath, a slow one, in through the nose. Hold it for just a moment and let it go. Do it again and again. Feel how, with each exhale, something in you releases, some tension you didn't even know you were carrying, some tightness in your chest, some weight behind your eyes. Let it drift away, like smoke dissolving into the night air. The day is done. Whatever it held, the wins, the losses, the moments you wish had gone differently, it's behind you now. You cannot reach back and change it. But right here, right now, in this quiet room, in this stillness, you have something precious. You have a moment of peace. And peace, it turns out, is where everything truly begins. Maybe your mind is still moving. Maybe it's replaying conversations, rewriting emails, rehearsing things you should have said. Maybe it's skipping ahead to tomorrow, to the alarm, to the list, to the faces and the responsibilities that will greet you the moment you open your eyes. Or maybe you're thinking about the life you imagined you would have by now, the version of yourself you were so sure you'd become, and how, looking around at this moment, it doesn't quite look like that yet. That's okay. Really, it is. Because this moment right here, this quiet, this stillness, this small window of honest awareness, is where change actually begins. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic midnight epiphanies, not in the frantic energy of a new year or a Monday morning, or a particularly motivating video you stumbled across online. Real change begins in moments exactly like this one. Quiet, unremarkable, honest. And if something in the story we're about to share feels familiar, if it feels somewhere in your chest, like someone finally understands what you've been going through, then subscribe. Not for me, for you. So you can come back night after night to reset, to refocus, to gently remind yourself that progress is built quietly, patiently, and consistently in the dark when no one is watching. Now, let's begin. There was a man whose life, from the outside, looked perfectly normal. He had a job, not glamorous, but stable. He had responsibilities, a routine, a home with familiar corners and creaking floors he'd stopped noticing years ago. He had friends, family, the occasional dinner out, the occasional weekend where nothing much happened. Everything, by most reasonable measures, was in order. But inside, there was something else, a feeling he couldn't quite name, something like a low hum in the walls of a house, the kind of sound you only notice in the deepest part of the night, when all the other noise has gone to sleep. It wasn't depression. He knew what that felt like. And this wasn't it. It wasn't grief or fear or anger. It was something quieter, subtler, more persistent. It was the feeling that he was living slightly off-center from his own life, like he was standing just to the side of where he was supposed to be. Every morning, his alarm would go off at the same time, and for a few seconds before his mind fully woke, before the gears engaged and the thoughts began to turn. There was peace, a brief, golden calm, where the world seemed still. No pressure, no expectations, no past, no future, just warmth and quiet and the soft sound of his own breathing. Then the thoughts would return. Like an incoming tide, they would wash over him. Everything he needed to do, everything he hadn't done, everything he kept promising himself he would start. The email he'd been drafting in his head for 3 days. The idea he'd had in the shower that he never wrote down. The plan he'd made on Sunday night that by Wednesday morning had already quietly dissolved. And then, almost automatically, before he'd even made a conscious choice, his hand would reach for his phone. The scrolling would begin. Not because he wanted to, not because there was anything in particular he was looking for, but because it delayed the moment of having to sit with himself, of having to face the day, of having to confront the quiet, insistent knowledge that he was not moving forward the way he wanted to. He would scroll through other people's mornings, other people's success, other people's discipline, the early risers, the cold showers, the gym selfies, the productivity routines laid out in neat numbered lists. And he would feel something complicated, a mixture of inspiration and inadequacy, of wanting to change and not knowing how, of being tired of wanting to change and not changing. By the time he put the phone down, 20 minutes had passed, sometimes 30, and the day, the real day, the day that belonged to him, had already started without him. He wasn't lazy. That's what made it so confusing. He worked hard, he showed up, he handled what needed to be handled. He never left people down, never missed a deadline that truly mattered, never gave anyone a reason to question his reliability. But there was no progress, no real forward movement, just repetition. The same patterns, the same feelings, the same quiet frustration recycled through the same weeks and months. Days blending into each other like watercolors running together in the rain. He began to wonder if this was simply what adulthood was, if the life he'd imagined, the one with purpose and momentum and that particular feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be, was just something they told you about when you were young to keep you moving. Maybe everyone felt this way. Maybe no one talked about it. Maybe the whole world was just a collection of people performing confidence they didn't entirely feel, performing progress they hadn't entirely made. But something in him wouldn't quite accept that. Something small and stubborn and persistent said, "Not yet, not done. Keep watching, keep looking. There is something here you haven't seen yet. The small things." He began to notice. It started with coffee. He had always made coffee in the morning. It was the one ritual he held on to no matter what. The smell of it, the warmth of the cup in his hands, the few minutes of something approaching ceremony before the chaos of the day began. But one morning, he noticed something. He was standing at the kitchen counter, watching the steam rise slowly from his cup. He noticed the way it curled and drifted before disappearing. He noticed the way the early light caught it. He noticed the warmth radiating from the ceramic into his palms, and the particular sweetness of the aroma, and the faint sound of the city beginning its day. Somewhere beyond the window, he stood there for 5 minutes without moving, without scrolling, without thinking about anything except what was right in front of him. And when he finally took a sip, he thought, "How many mornings have I let this moment pass without noticing it. He couldn't answer. There had been too many. That small realization, the noticing, the simple act of paying attention, felt like turning on a light in a room he'd been navigating in the dark. He began to look for other small things he'd been walking past. On his way to work, he started noticing the way the light changed between seasons, the particular gold of autumn mornings, the flat grey of winter afternoons, the shocking brightness of a spring day after a week of rain. He noticed the sound of his own footsteps on the pavement, the way his breath misted in the cold air, the weight of his bag across his shoulder, the feeling of the wind on his face. He noticed a bird landing on a branch above him one morning, delicate, precise, utterly unconcerned with the world beneath it. He stopped and watched it for almost a full minute. A man in a hurry would have walked past, but he was learning slowly to be a man who stopped. He noticed the smell of rain on concrete, the sound of a distant conversation he couldn't quite make out, the way a stranger's laugh could cut through the noise of the street and make the world feel, for just a moment, warmer. These were tiny things, invisible things, the kind of things that don't make it into any conversation about success or discipline or growth. But they were changing something in him, something quiet and foundational. Because when you start paying attention to the small things, when you practice the art of noticing, you stop moving through your life on autopilot. You start inhabiting it. And a life inhabited, even an imperfect one, is a life that can be shaped. He began carrying a small notebook. Nothing special. A plain, inexpensive thing he'd found in a drawer. He started writing things down. Not goals, not plans, not resolutions, just observations. The coffee was good this morning. I actually tasted it. Noticed I was anxious all afternoon and didn't know why. Worth thinking about. Walked past the same tree every day for 3 years. Finally looked at it today. It is remarkable. The entries were modest. Sometimes a single sentence. Sometimes just a word or two. But over time, those pages became something he hadn't expected. A mirror. A quiet, honest record of a life that was more textured and interesting than he'd given it credit for. And in that mirror, he began to see patterns. Not just the beautiful ones, the morning light, the steam, the birds, but the other ones, the ones that had been quietly shaping his days, the patterns beneath the surface. He had always thought of his problems, if you could call them problems, as things that happened to him. The distraction, the procrastination, the gap between the life he imagined and the life he was actually living. These had felt, until now, like weather, like conditions he was subject to, not causes he was participating in. But as he read back through his notebook one evening, something shifted. He began to see the thread. He noticed, for instance, that every time he had an important task he was anxious about, he would spend the first hour of the morning doing something else entirely, answering emails that could wait, tidying his desk, making a second cup of coffee he didn't need, doing anything essentially except the thing. He noticed that every time he had an interesting idea, he would think, I should write that down, and then not write it down. And then, a few days later, he would have the sense of reaching for something that was no longer there. A memory with a shape, but no substance. He noticed that when he was tired or stressed, he defaulted to the same 3 or 4 behaviors, scrolling, snacking, watching something he'd already seen, going to bed later than he intended, and waking up feeling behind before the day had even started. None of these were dramatic. None of them were the kind of thing you'd mention in a conversation. They were micro behaviors, tiny, repeated choices that each individually seemed harmless. But together, they had built something, like drops of water, slowly and invisibly, building up over time. They had built a life that felt stuck. And here was the thing that stopped him cold when he finally saw it clearly. If small, repeated choices could build a stuck life, they could also build a free one. The same mechanism that had been working against him could work for him. The same compound effect that had accumulated into stagnation could accumulate into progress. All it required was noticing the pattern and making different choices. Not perfect choices, not dramatic ones, just different ones, small ones, repeated ones. He thought about water again. Not the drops this time, but the river. How a river doesn't cut through rock by force. It doesn't smash its way through in a single furious effort. It moves steadily, patiently, consistently, day after day, year after year. And the rock, the hard, immovable rock, eventually yields. Not because the water is stronger, but because the water never stops. He wanted to be the river. He began to pay attention differently, not just to the world around him, but to himself, to the small decisions, the micro choices, the moments where one path diverged from another, the moment he reached for his phone instead of his notebook, the moment he chose the familiar comfort of a known task over the uncomfortable territory of a new one, the moment he said, "I'll do it tomorrow," when what he really meant was, "I'm afraid to do it today." These were the hinges on which his life swung. And he had been walking past them every day without seeing them. Not anymore. The first experiments. He decided to run an experiment. He wasn't going to overhaul his life. He wasn't going to wake up at 4 in the morning or sign up for a marathon or meditate for an hour each day. He'd tried those approaches before. The big, total, dramatic change. And they always collapsed within a week, leaving him feeling worse than before he'd started. This time, he was going to go small. Smaller than felt significant. Smaller than felt worth mentioning. He was going to find the smallest possible version of the change he wanted, and do that, consistently, without fanfare. The first experiment. Wake up 15 minutes earlier. Not an hour, not 90 minutes, 15 minutes. Just enough to sit with his coffee without immediately opening his phone. Just enough to let the morning exist for a moment before he filled it with noise. The first few days were unremarkable. He sat there. He drank his coffee. Sometimes he thought about things. Sometimes he didn't think about much at all. Nothing particularly enlightening happened. But on the 5th day, he noticed something. He felt less reactive in the mornings, less like he was catching up to a day that had already started without him. More like he had, in some small way, chosen the morning, rather than been dragged into it. It was a subtle feeling, easy to dismiss. But he wrote it down. The second experiment. 1 page. Every evening before he went to bed, he would write 1 page, just one. Not a plan or a goal or a list of affirmations, just whatever was in his head. Stream of consciousness, no editing, no judgment. 1 page and stop. The first night, he stared at the blank page for 10 minutes before writing anything. The second night was easier. By the end of the first week, he was sometimes filling the page and wanting to write more. He noticed that writing things down made them real in a way that thinking about them never did. A worry that circled in his mind for hours could be defused by putting it on paper. An idea that felt vague and half-formed became clear the moment he tried to describe it in words. His thoughts, it turned out, were much more manageable when they were out of his head and on a page. The third experiment. One hard thing per day. Every day, he identified one task he'd been avoiding, something that produced that particular feeling of resistance he'd grown so familiar with. The tight stomach, the impulse to do something easier instead, the thought, "I'll get to that later." And he did it first. Not later. First. Before the easy things, before the comfortable things, before he'd built up enough momentum to feel confident, before he felt ready. The first day, the hard thing was a phone call he'd been dreading for 2 weeks. He made it in the first hour of the morning. It took 12 minutes. The other person was perfectly pleasant. The dread he'd been carrying for 14 days evaporated completely in 12 minutes. He sat for a moment afterwards and thought about all the energy he'd spent dreading that call, all the cognitive weight he'd been carrying, all the slightly off feeling that came from having an avoided task sitting in the back of his mind. 12 minutes. And it was gone. He started noticing this with almost everything he avoided. The doing of it was almost never as bad as the dreading of it. In fact, the doing was almost always fine. It was the not doing that was the true cost. The not doing accumulated interest. It became heavier with every day it wasn't done. These 3 experiments, 15 minutes, 1 page, 1 hard thing, were not revolutionary. They were not the stuff of best-selling books or viral videos. They were almost embarrassingly simple. But at the end of the first month, he sat down with his notebook and read back through the pages. He noticed something he hadn't expected. He felt different, not transformed, not suddenly successful or disciplined, or the person he'd always imagined becoming. Just different, slightly clearer, slightly more capable of facing the day without that familiar dread, slightly more like someone who was moving in a direction rather than standing still. And that feeling, quiet, unspectacular, barely visible, was more valuable than anything he'd felt in years. The lies we tell ourselves. He had always believed, somewhere in the unexamined parts of his thinking, that motivation was something that came before action. You felt motivated, then you acted. That was the sequence. That was how it worked. Which meant that when the motivation wasn't there, and it usually wasn't, not in any reliable or dependable way, the logical conclusion was to wait. Wait until the motivation arrived. Wait for the right moment, the right energy, the right alignment of conditions. He had spent years waiting, and the motivation, it turned out, was in no particular hurry. He began to question this. He picked up a few books, not the flashy self-help kind with bold promises on the cover, but quieter, more careful books about how human behavior actually worked, about the psychology of habits and decisions and change. And he found something that contradicted almost everything he'd assumed. Motivation, the research suggested, is not the cause of action. It is frequently the result of it. You don't feel motivated and then act. You act even a little, even imperfectly, even when you don't feel like it. And the action itself generates the feeling we call motivation. Momentum comes first. The feeling follows. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about all the times he'd sat at his desk waiting to feel inspired before writing something, and how the blank page had never inspired him. How it was only once he'd written the first terrible sentence that the second, slightly better sentence became possible. He thought about the gym and how he'd never once felt like going in the car park, but how he'd also never once regretted going once he'd started. He thought about the lie and how he'd believed it for so long without question. The lie, I'll start when I feel ready. The truth, you feel ready after you start. He thought about the other lies, the ones that had felt so reasonable, so sensible, so obviously true that he'd never thought to examine them. Lie number 2, I work better under pressure. He'd said this to himself for years, used it to justify procrastination, used it to explain the last-minute scramble, the rushed finish, the work that was good enough but not what it could have been. And there was a grain of truth in it. Pressure did create focus, but the focus came at a cost. The stress, the shortcuts, the nagging knowledge that given more time, he could have done better. He wasn't working better under pressure. He was surviving under pressure. There's a difference. Lie number 3, I'm just not the kind of person who is naturally disciplined. This one was the most seductive. It turned a behavior into an identity, a choice into a characteristic, a habit into a nature. It made discipline feel like something you either had or didn't, rather than something you built through repeated action. It was a closed door, and he had walked up to it so many times, tried the handle, found it locked, and walked away, when the whole time the door hadn't been locked at all. He just never really pushed it. He began to see these lies as what they actually were, not truths about his nature, but habits of thought, stories he'd been telling himself so long they'd calcified into beliefs. And like all habits, they could be changed, not through willpower or self-criticism, but through patient, deliberate repetition of different thoughts. He started practicing. When the thought came, I don't feel ready, he would notice it, name it. That's the old story, he'd think. That's the one that says wait. And then quietly, he would do one small thing anyway. Not the whole thing, just one small step toward it. When the thought came, I'm just not disciplined by nature, he would notice that too. That's a story, he'd tell himself. Stories can be rewritten. It felt strange at first, slightly performative, like he was playing a role he hadn't quite grown into. But he kept going, and slowly, so slowly that he almost missed it, the new story started to feel more natural, started to feel less like a performance and more like a description. What wealth actually means. Around this time, he began thinking about money. Not obsessively, not with anxiety, but with a kind of calm, honest curiosity he hadn't allowed himself before. He had always had a complicated relationship with money, not because he was irresponsible. He paid his bills. He wasn't in serious debt. He didn't make reckless decisions. But he also wasn't building anything. He wasn't growing. Month after month, the number in his account was more or less the same, give or take whatever unexpected thing had come up. He wasn't poor. But he wasn't free either. He started reading about personal finance. Simple things, at first. The fundamentals. The kind of principles that financial educators talk about so often. They almost become background noise. And yet, when he actually paid attention to them, really paid attention, he felt something shift. The first principle was almost embarrassingly simple. Spend less than you earn. He knew this. Of course he knew this. Everybody knows this. But knowing something and actually tracking it, actually watching where each pound or dollar or rand goes, actually building a picture of the flow of money in and out of your life, that was something else entirely. He started tracking his spending, every purchase, logged in a small app on his phone. No judgment, no restriction, just observation, just data. At the end of the first month, he sat with the numbers. He was surprised. Not by any single line item. Nothing was shocking on its own. But the pattern was revealing. The small, habitual, unconsidered purchases. The coffees he bought when he could have made one at home. The subscriptions he'd forgotten he had. The takeaway meals when food sat untouched in the fridge. Added up to a number that startled him. Not because it was huge, but because of what it represented. That money, redirected, could be doing something. It could be building something. It could be working for him instead of quietly disappearing. He remembered something he'd read, that the first step to wealth is not earning more. It's stopping the leak. He began to plug the leaks, carefully, not drastically. He wasn't interested in deprivation. He wasn't going to give up every pleasure in pursuit of some abstract future number. But he started making conscious choices, asking himself, before each purchase, is this worth more than what it could become? That question, quietly transformative, almost imperceptible in the moment, changed the way he related to money. He opened a savings account, separate from his main account, the kind you have to make a deliberate decision to transfer into, so that the money doesn't just disappear into the general pool. He set up an automatic transfer, small, consistent, automatic. It happened without requiring willpower, without requiring memory or motivation. Just like his morning routine, just like his notebook, just like his one hard thing per day. Small, consistent, automatic. He began to see a pattern across every area of life he'd been exploring. The same principle kept appearing, wearing different clothes. In health, small, consistent movement, day after day, accumulates into strength and vitality. In knowledge, reading a little every day accumulates into expertise you can't point to a single source for. In relationships, small, consistent acts of attention and kindness accumulate into trust and depth. In money, small, consistent saving and investing, held long enough, accumulates into freedom. The principle was everywhere, and it had a name: compounding. He had always thought of compounding as a financial concept, interest on interest, returns on returns. The reason why starting to invest at 22 is so much more powerful than starting at 32. But compounding, he realized, was a universal law. It applied to habits, to knowledge, to relationships, to health, to character. Every domain of a good life was subject to it. The question was simply, what are you compounding? Because compounding is neutral. It doesn't care whether you're compounding growth or stagnation. It doesn't discriminate between useful habits and destructive ones. It simply takes whatever you give it, day after day, and multiplies. He had been compounding distraction. He had been compounding avoidance. He had been compounding the habit of waiting for the right moment. Now, slowly, he was beginning to compound something else. The garden. He had a small outdoor space. A balcony, really. Barely large enough for a chair and a few pots. One spring, on a quiet Saturday morning, he decided to plant something. He didn't have any particular plan. He went to a small garden center nearby and bought a few pots of herbs. Basil, mint, rosemary. Nothing elaborate. He brought them home, arranged them on the balcony railing, watered them, and went back inside. He didn't expect much, but he kept watering them every morning as part of the small rituals he'd been building. The 15 minutes, the coffee, the notebook. He would step outside for a moment and water the plants. It took perhaps 2 minutes, sometimes less, and the plants grew. Not dramatically, not overnight, not in any way that was particularly remarkable, but steadily, quietly. Day by day, imperceptibly, they filled out their pots. The basil went from sparse to lush. The rosemary thickened and spread. The mint, given an inch, took a foot, spilling over the sides of its pot and reaching toward the light. He began to think of himself as one of those plants. He had been, for a long time, in a pot that wasn't being watered, not dying exactly, but not growing either, just holding, just existing, waiting for conditions to change. But conditions, he now understood, don't simply change. They are changed by attention, by consistent care, by the quiet, patient, unremarkable act of showing up every day and doing the small thing. He thought about the garden as a metaphor for his finances. You don't plant a tree and then stand there waiting for fruit. You plant the tree, you water it, you make sure it has what it needs, and then you wait. Not passively, not anxiously, but patiently, trusting the process, trusting the compounding. He thought about it as a metaphor for his habits. A new habit is fragile at first, like a seedling, easily uprooted, easily forgotten, easily overwhelmed by the weeds of old behavior. But given consistent attention, given water and light, and the small daily effort of care, it puts down roots. And roots, once established, are surprisingly hard to kill. He thought about it as a metaphor for his relationships, the friendships he'd neglected, not maliciously, just thoughtlessly, in the way that busy people neglect the things that don't demand immediate attention. Those friendships had thinned like a plant in a dark room. But with a little water, a text, a phone call, a question asked with genuine interest, they began to respond. Life returning where there had been quiet. The garden taught him something he suspected he'd always known, but had never put into words. Neglect is not neutral. When you fail to tend something, you are making a choice. Not tending is tending. It's just tending toward a different outcome. The plants don't stay the same without water. They don't just pause. They wilt. They thin. They die. Life works the same way. Relationships not tended drift. Bodies not moved stiffen and weaken. Minds not fed grow slow and narrow. Savings not invested sit still, while inflation does its quiet, patient work in the opposite direction. To maintain something, you must tend it. And to grow something, you must tend it a little more. He stood on his balcony one evening in late summer, rosemary in hand, and thought, this is it. This is what I've been missing. Not a grand strategy, not a dramatic overhaul, just the consistent, patient, daily act of tending to what matters. The cost of comfort. There was a particular chair in his living room that he loved. It was deep and soft and positioned perfectly in relation to the television. It was the kind of chair that seemed to hold you rather than just support you. The kind that made the idea of getting up feel mildly absurd. He spent a lot of time in that chair, and he began to realize that the chair, beloved as it was, had become a kind of trap. Not because rest is wrong. Rest is necessary. Rest is the counterbalance to effort, the recovery that makes the next push possible. He had nothing against rest, but this wasn't rest. This was avoidance dressed up as rest. This was comfort used as a substitute for the discomfort of growth. He began to distinguish between the two. Real rest, reading something good, sleeping deeply, having a real conversation with a friend, cooking a meal slowly, spending time outdoors, things that replenished something. Avoidance comfort, the empty scroll, the second episode after the first had already finished. The fog of passive consumption that left him feeling simultaneously restless and exhausted. He wasn't judging himself for it. He wasn't going to condemn the chair or swear off television or impose some monastic discipline on his evenings. He was just going to start noticing, just going to bring the same quality of attention to his comfort choices that he'd been bringing to everything else. What is this moment actually doing for me? Sometimes the answer was nothing, and that was the signal to make a different choice. He started thinking about the concept of discomfort differently. For most of his life, discomfort had been a stop sign, a signal that something was wrong, that he should back away, that he'd reached a boundary and ought to respect it. But he began to understand that there were different kinds of discomfort. There was the discomfort of damage, pain signals, warning signs, the body or mind telling you that something is genuinely harmful and needs to stop. This discomfort deserves respect. And then there was the discomfort of growth, the awkward feeling of doing something new, the resistance that comes before every breakthrough, the tightness that precedes expansion. This discomfort, followed through, leads somewhere. It is productive. It is, in fact, the feeling of becoming. He had been treating all discomfort as the first kind when most of it was the second. He started experimenting with discomfort on purpose. Small doses, managed doses, not extreme or punishing, but intentional. Cold water at the end of his shower, just 30 seconds, then a minute, then longer. Not because anyone had told him to, but because it required him to choose something difficult in the moment. And choosing something difficult, even something small, was practice for choosing something difficult when it mattered. A harder walk instead of an easier one. Stairs instead of the lift. The long way around instead of the shortcut. Sitting with an uncomfortable feeling for a moment before reaching for his phone. He was building a muscle, not a visible one, not the kind you can photograph, but a real one nonetheless. The muscle of voluntary discomfort, of choosing hard over easy when easy wasn't serving him. And he noticed something interesting. The more he practiced choosing discomfort intentionally, the less the big discomforts, the feared conversations, the difficult decisions, the moments of real challenge seemed to overwhelm him. It was as if the small practices were widening his capacity, expanding what he could hold without breaking. The chair was still there. He still sat in it sometimes, but now it felt like a choice rather than a default. And a comfort chosen is something different than a comfort fallen into. Learning to see money clearly. He had grown up in a house where money wasn't discussed openly. It was present. It was always present, in the sense that its presence or absence shaped almost every decision. But it wasn't talked about, not honestly, not the way you might talk about other important things. Money was either a source of quiet stress or a subject changed when it got uncomfortable. It was something you managed, not something you understood, something you dealt with, not something you learned. And so he had arrived at adulthood with a functional relationship with money. He could handle the basics, but not a particularly educated one. He knew how to pay a bill. He didn't really know how to build. He decided to change that. He started simply. He read one book, a clear, jargon-free introduction to personal finance that explained concepts he'd always vaguely known without really understanding. He didn't try to absorb everything at once. He read slowly, took notes, let ideas settle. He learned about the difference between assets and liabilities in terms he actually understood. An asset puts money in your pocket. A liability takes money out. Simple, almost obvious. And yet, looking at his own life, he realized how many liabilities he had accepted as neutral, how many things he paid for month after month that returned nothing. He learned about the difference between saving and investing. Saving is keeping money. Investing is putting money to work. Both matter. Neither is a substitute for the other. He learned about index funds, the idea that rather than trying to pick the winning individual investment, you could simply own a small piece of everything, spreading risk so broadly that the success of the whole market worked in your favor over time. He learned that most professional fund managers, with all their expertise and research, consistently underperform a simple low-cost index fund held for the long term. This felt significant to him. The expert, trying hard, usually loses to the patient, consistent, unconsidered approach. He recognized the principle. He'd seen it everywhere now. The person who meditates for 5 minutes every day beats the person who does an intensive 3-hour session once and then never again. The person who saves a small amount automatically every month beats the person who tries to save large amounts through willpower and intention. Consistency beats intensity almost every time, across almost every domain. He opened an investment account. It took 45 minutes and felt both exciting and anticlimactic, the way most genuinely important things do. He set up an automatic monthly investment, small but regular, automatic. He tried not to look at it too often after that. He understood now that the watching, the obsessing, the anxious tracking of daily fluctuations was counterproductive. The power of long-term investing is that it requires almost nothing of you except patience and consistency. The looking, the worrying, the interfering, those were the things that destroyed returns. He was learning slowly to be patient, to trust the river. He also started learning about income, not in the sense of asking for a raise or chasing a promotion, though he noted those conversations for later, but in the broader sense, what are the different ways money can come in, and which of them depend entirely on his time, and which of them can work even when he isn't working. He learned the difference between active income, money exchanged for time and effort, and passive income, money generated by assets by systems, by things already built. Most people, he realized, have only one stream, one job, one salary, one source. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it means that everything depends on one thing: the job, the salary. One decision by one other person could change everything. He wasn't going to overthrow his life overnight, but he began to think, carefully and without urgency, about what a second stream might look like. Something small, something real, something he could build over time. A side skill, a small online service, a piece of writing, a course. Something that could, eventually, generate a little value independent of his hours. He didn't rush it. He just held it as a direction. And holding a direction he'd learned is the first step toward moving in it. The quiet art of reflection. There is a particular kind of thinking that most of us almost never do. We think reactively, responding to what's in front of us, putting out fires, managing what demands attention. We think anxiously, running through worst cases, rehearsing conversations, worrying about things we cannot control. We think nostalgically, revisiting the past, polishing memories, replaying moments that no longer exist. But deliberate, structured reflection, sitting quietly with the questions: what is actually happening in my life? What is working? What isn't? What do I want more of? What do I want less of? This kind of thinking is remarkably rare. He made it a practice. Once a week on Sunday evenings, he would spend 30 minutes in genuine reflection. Not planning. Planning came later. Just looking honestly at the week that had passed. He developed a set of questions he asked himself. What moments this week felt alive? What moments felt like I was just going through the motions? What did I avoid that I shouldn't have? What did I do that I'm quietly proud of? Where did my energy go? Was that where I wanted it to go? What did I learn? These weren't easy questions. Honest answers rarely are. But they created something valuable, a map, a record of a life actually examined, rather than simply lived. Over months, he began to notice larger patterns in the weekly reflections. He noticed that his energy was highest in the mornings and lowest in the late afternoons. So he started putting his most important work at the front of the day and saving administrative tasks for the post-lunch slump. He noticed that he felt best on weeks when he'd spent time outside. So he started protecting that, treating it not as a luxury, but as a necessity. He noticed that certain people in his life consistently left him feeling energized, and certain others consistently left him feeling drained. And he began, carefully, to adjust his time accordingly. None of these were revelations in isolation, but seeing them clearly, written in his own hand, week after week, made them real in a way that vague, unexamined impressions never could. He also began reflecting on his relationship with failure. He had always been afraid of it in the way most people are, viscerally, personally, as if failure were a verdict rather than a data point. A failure meant something was wrong with him, not just with the attempt. He began to practice a different relationship. When something didn't work, he asked, "What can I learn from this?" Not what does this say about me, but what does this tell me about the approach? An experiment that produces a result you didn't want is still an experiment that produces a result. The result tells you something. It narrows the field. It shows you what doesn't work, which is genuinely useful information on the way to finding what does. He thought of Thomas Edison, who reportedly said, after hundreds of failed attempts to invent a working light bulb, that he had not failed. He had simply discovered hundreds of ways that didn't work. He had, in other words, been systematically eliminating the wrong answers until only the right one remained. He started applying this to his own experiments, the morning routine that lasted 2 weeks before he dropped it. Useful data. The investment approach he tried before realizing it wasn't right for him. Useful data. The creative project he started and abandoned. Useful data about what excited him and what didn't. Nothing wasted. Everything learned. On the subject of time, he had always thought of himself as busy. And in a surface sense, he was. There was always something, a task, a responsibility, a message to return, a meeting to prepare for, an errand to run. The texture of his days was dense with activity. But when he started paying close attention, really close attention, he noticed something uncomfortable. Much of his busyness wasn't producing anything. It was motion without progress, activity without direction, the sensation of being busy without the substance of being productive. He did an experiment. For 1 week, he tracked how he actually spent his time, not how he planned to spend it, not how he thought he'd spent it, how he actually did, in 30-minute blocks every day, honest, specific, without softening. At the end of the week, he sat with the data. He was genuinely startled. The hours that had felt vaguely busy, the hours that he would have described as working or getting things done, when accounted for specifically, were often only partially productive. There were long stretches of context, switching, of half-starting tasks, and then being pulled away, of managing and responding rather than creating and building. And the hours he hadn't accounted for at all, the ones that had just seemed to disappear, when he traced them honestly, were substantial. They went to the scroll, to the drift, to the television, to the vague, unstructured time that felt like rest, but wasn't restoring anything. He did some math. It was humbling. If he reclaimed just 90 minutes a day, 90 minutes from the unproductive drift, from the scrolling, from the activities that cost his attention without giving anything back, he would have over 500 hours a year to put towards something that mattered to him. 500 hours. In 500 hours, you can learn a language to conversational level. You can write a book. You can build a business from an idea to a revenue-generating operation. You can develop a skill from curious beginner to genuine competence. He hadn't been short of time. He'd been short of intentionality. He began to treat his attention as the finite, precious resource it actually is. Every time he gave his attention to something, a screen, a conversation, a task, an activity, he was spending something. And like money, it mattered where you spent it. He started building what he called an attention budget. He decided, in advance, where his best attention would go each day. The most important creative or building work got the first, freshest hours. Communication and administrative tasks got the middle. Rest and recovery were scheduled, not accidental. He wasn't rigid about it. Life doesn't accommodate rigidity. But having the intention meant that even when the day went sideways, as days often do, he had a thread to return to, a direction. He also began to think about time at a larger scale. Not just the day, but the year, the decade. He was not young, but he was not old. He had, if he was fortunate, decades ahead of him. and those decades would pass regardless of what he did with them. The question was only what they would contain. He thought about a conversation he'd read about once, a thought experiment where you imagine yourself at 80 looking back. What would 80-year-old you be glad you did? What would 80-year-old you wish you'd started sooner? The answers surprised him with their clarity. Not the things he expected, not the status or the achievements or the recognition, but the experiences, the relationships, the things built, the person become. He wrote those answers down and put them somewhere he could find them. Because sometimes, when the day gets hard and the small choices feel like they don't matter, it helps to remember the larger picture, to remember who you're building toward. Relationships as infrastructure. He had, for most of his adult life, thought of his relationships somewhat passively. He had the friends he'd had for years, the ones who'd arrived naturally through school or work or circumstance. He maintained them, more or less, with varying degrees of attention. He was generally considered a good friend. He showed up when it mattered. He was loyal, thoughtful, dependable. But he wasn't building. He wasn't intentional. He was maintaining at best, and at worst, he was simply hoping that the relationships would sustain themselves on the goodwill already accumulated. He began to think about relationships the way he was learning to think about everything else, as something that requires consistent tending, something subject to the same laws of compounding he was discovering everywhere. Small, consistent acts of connection, a text sent with genuine thought, a question asked with real curiosity, a remembered detail brought up at the right moment. These accumulated into something, into depth, into the kind of friendship that can bear weight. Neglect accumulated too, into drift, into the polite distance of two people who once knew each other well and are now mostly just familiar with each other's names. He made a small decision, one intentional connection per week, not a grand gesture, not a long overdue apology, not a dramatic rekindling, just one message, one call, one coffee with someone he valued, sent with real intention. He reached out to an old friend he hadn't spoken to in over a year. The friend replied within an hour, warmly, with obvious pleasure. They arranged to meet. The conversation, when it happened, was easy and rich, and reminded him of why the friendship had mattered in the first place. He had been holding back from reaching out because something in him feared the awkwardness of the long gap, feared being reminded of how long he'd let something important sit unattended. But the awkwardness, when he finally made the move, lasted about 30 seconds. And then it was just two people who liked each other, picking up something that had been temporarily set down. He thought about his professional relationships too, the colleagues he'd been cordial but not genuinely curious about, the people in adjacent fields whose work he admired but had never thought to approach, the mentors he'd always meant to seek but never quite had. He recognized something he'd read about, that most of the important opportunities in a person's life come not from their close network, but from their extended one, from the acquaintances, the loose connections, the people you know just well enough to be genuinely interested in each other. He began to invest there, too, with the same patient, consistent energy he was bringing to everything else. And he noticed something that felt like a law of human nature. When you are genuinely interested in people, not performatively, not strategically, but actually curious about how they think and what they've experienced and what matters to them, they respond, they open, they share. And the connection that results is valuable in ways that are almost impossible to plan for. Curiosity, it turned out, was one of the most practical things he owned. The identity beneath the habits. There came a point, somewhere in the middle of all this quiet, patient experimentation, when he noticed something unexpected. He was starting to think of himself differently, not dramatically, not with some sudden surge of confidence or a sense of having arrived somewhere. It was subtler than that, more interior, more real. He was beginning to identify as someone who does certain things, someone who writes, someone who moves, someone who reads, someone who manages his finances with attention and care, someone who shows up for the people he values. He hadn't declared this. He hadn't posted it anywhere or told anyone. It had just accumulated through the repeated actions, through the small, daily choices that, together, had started to tell a different story about who he was. He had read, in one of the quieter books he'd picked up, about the relationship between identity and behavior, about how most people try to change their behavior by setting goals. I want to run a marathon. I want to save 10,000. I want to write a book. When the more durable approach is to change identity. Not, I want to become a runner, but I am a runner. Not, I'm trying to save money, but I am someone who invests in my future. The identity comes first. Then the behavior flows from it. Or rather, and this was the part that had taken him a while to fully understand, the identity and the behavior build each other. Small actions, repeated, create evidence for a new identity. The new identity makes further actions more natural. The actions reinforce the identity. A spiral. Upward this time. He had spent years in a downward version of this spiral without knowing it. Small avoidances had accumulated into the identity of someone who avoids. Small delays had accumulated into the identity of someone who procrastinates. Small discomforts accepted had accumulated into the identity of someone who is not disciplined. Now he was slowly, patiently, consistently building evidence for a different identity. One action at a time. One choice at a time. He wasn't there yet. He wouldn't claim to be the person he was becoming. But the direction was clear, and the movement was real, and that felt like enough. More than enough, actually. It felt like the first time in years that he could look at his own life and say, with something approaching honesty, yes, this is moving forward. What he learned about business. He had always been vaguely interested in business, in the idea of building something, of creating value, of not simply trading time for money, but generating something that could grow independently of his direct effort. But it had always felt distant, like something that happened to other people, people with capital or connections, or the particular species of confidence that he had always assumed he lacked. As he'd grown in other areas, he found himself returning to this interest, not urgently, but persistently, like a door he kept passing and wondering what was on the other side. He started paying attention to how businesses actually worked. Not the MBA textbook version, not the startup mythology, but the real version. The small, local, unglamorous businesses that formed the fabric of everyday commerce. The baker who opened at 5 in the morning. The independent bookshop that somehow survived. The freelancer who had built a steady client base through nothing more than good work and consistent reliability. he noticed something that seemed to run through all of them. None of them were trying to get rich quick. All of them were doing something specific, doing it well, and doing it consistently enough that people trusted them. That was it. That was the whole model. Not magic, not disruption, not a secret formula. Just find a genuine value to offer. Offer it with integrity and keep showing up. He began to think about what genuine value he could offer. He was skilled at certain things. Over the course of his working life, he had developed real competencies, things he could do well, things people often came to him for, things that solved real problems for real people. He had always thought of these competencies as just part of his job. But they were more than that. They were a foundation. He started small, impossibly small. He offered his skill to one person outside his normal context, a friend who needed something he could provide. He did it well. The friend was grateful, referred him to someone else. He began to see the shape of something. Not a business yet, not even close, but a direction. A small, honest capability being offered to a person who needed it. That was the seed. He understood now, more than he ever had before, that business, real business, durable business, is not primarily about money. It's about trust. And trust is built exactly the same way everything else of value is built. Slowly, consistently, through repeated evidence that you do what you say you'll do. He thought about a phrase he'd come across. The market rewards the patient. Not the brilliant, not the bold, the patient, the ones who show up long enough for the trust to accumulate. He was learning to be patient. The long game. He was, by any honest measure, not yet where he wanted to be. His finances were better, measurably, concretely better, but not transformed. His habits were more consistent, but not perfect. His work was stronger, but still had a long way to go. His relationships were richer, but some of the most important ones still needed more attention. He hadn't arrived. He wasn't going to pretend he had. But he had something he hadn't had before. He had a direction, and he had evidence, real, personal, lived evidence, that movement in that direction was possible, that the small choices compounded, that patience was not passive, that showing up quietly and consistently, in the ordinary moments when no one was watching and nothing felt particularly meaningful, was the actual work. Not the dramatic breakthrough, not the overnight transformation, the daily, unsexy, unglamorous practice of being slightly better than yesterday. He thought about athletes and what he'd read about the concept of marginal gains, the idea, popularized by cycling teams, that if you improve every element of performance by just 1%, sleep, nutrition, training technique, equipment, recovery, the combined effect is transformative. That 1% better at 100 things adds up to something far greater than the sum of its parts. He was playing a marginal gains game. 1% better at habits, 1% better at attention, 1% better at money management, 1% better at showing up for the people he loved. The math was on his side. The math had always been on his side. He just had to be patient enough to let it work. He thought about the version of himself from a year ago, the man who lay awake at night with that low, persistent hum, the man who reached for his phone before he'd even decided to be awake, the man who felt stuck in ways he couldn't name, moving through days that felt like echoes of each other. He felt compassion for that man. Not pity, compassion. because that man had been doing his best with what he understood. He hadn't been lazy or foolish or fundamentally flawed. He had simply been missing a way of seeing that made the right choices possible. And now he had that way of seeing. Not perfectly, not permanently. It required maintenance, daily maintenance, just like everything else worth having. But it was there, accessible, real. He made a promise to himself. Not a dramatic resolution, not a solemn oath, just a quiet commitment, made in a quiet moment, to the principles that had changed his life. To keep noticing, to keep acting despite the resistance, to keep the slow, patient, consistent practice of growth going, even when it felt like nothing was happening. Because he now knew what he hadn't known before. Something is always happening, even when you can't see it, even when you can't feel it. Underneath the visible surface, the work is accumulating. The roots are growing deeper. The compound interest is calculating silently in the background. The river is moving. A final word, just for you. Now let me speak to you directly, not to the character in the story, to you, the person lying here, in this room, in this moment. You've been listening, maybe drifting in and out. Maybe some part of you has been thinking about your own version of that man's story, your own patterns, your own quiet gap between who you are and who you've imagined becoming. That's good. That's the right response. I want you to know something. You don't need to fix everything tonight. You don't need to create a plan or set a goal or make a resolution. You don't need to wake up tomorrow with a new identity fully installed and a clear path stretching before you. You don't need to be, by morning, the person you're working toward. You just need one small thing. Tomorrow morning, before the phone, before the scroll, before the incoming tide of other people's expectations and demands, give yourself 5 minutes. Just 5. Sit with your coffee or your tea, or just with the quiet. Let the morning exist for a moment before you fill it with noise. That's it. That's your one small thing. And the next day, maybe one more. The hard task you've been avoiding. Just start it. Not finish it. Just start. Write the first sentence. Make the first call. Take the first step. The rest will be easier once you've begun. And the evening after that, write something down. Not a plan, not goals. Just what you noticed, what felt real, what you're grateful for, what you want to do differently tomorrow. These tiny actions, morning, the one hard thing, the evening reflection, they are not small. They only look small. What they are, actually, is the foundation, the thing everything else is built on. Think about your relationship with money, not with guilt or anxiety, but with curiosity. Where does it go? Is it going where you want it to go? What would it mean to redirect just a little of it, just a small, automatic, forgettable amount, toward the future version of you? Think about your attention. You have a finite amount of it. Every day, you spend it somewhere. Is it going toward the life you want to build, or toward the things that feel comfortable in the moment, but leave you feeling hollow at the end of the night? Think about the stories you tell yourself. I'm not disciplined. I'm not the kind of person who. I'll start when I feel ready. These are stories. They are not facts. And stories, with patience, with practice, with the accumulated evidence of small repeated choices, can be rewritten. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are, right now, in this quiet moment, exactly where you need to be to take the next step. The step is small. The step is available. The step is yours to take whenever you're ready. And here is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you. The person you are becoming is not someone else. It is not a stranger you admire from a distance, living a life you can only imagine. It is you, the same you, with the same history, the same fears, the same quiet hope, choosing differently, slowly, consistently, one small choice at a time. The river is moving, even now, even in the dark, even while you sleep. The work continues, the compounding continues, the roots grow deeper in the dark, reaching for water you can't see. So let yourself rest now. Let the thoughts slow. Let the muscles soften. Let the breath come long and easy. Tomorrow is waiting, not to judge you, not to demand something you don't have, but to offer you what every day offers: another chance, another choice, another small, quiet, powerful opportunity to be the person you are becoming. You are not where you started. You are not where you're going. You are somewhere in between, which is exactly where growth lives. And that is more than enough. That is everything. Sleep now. You've earned it. And when you wake, tend the garden.